and welcome back. I am really glad that you're here. This week, we're talking all about week 3 at Starfish Social Club summer camp. And it's interesting how every week seems to kind of take on a theme or an identity. But of course, I never know what it will be until we get about halfway through the week. Last week on week 2, it definitely was how we handle and deal with difficulty. Week 2, we had just a lot of different situations where kids were kind of struggling, having a hard time. Week 3 really was about progress and growth. It's to be expected for the students who've been coming since day 1. It's to be expected that by the time we get to week 3, we'll really start to see some cool growth moments. But it also happened in kids who had only been coming a day or two. So it was just a really great week for the things that we've been working on and learning and talking about to come together really well. It's a really fun week. So as I do, I will go through day by day and just kind of summarize some of the things. I try to take notes as we go. So just try to summarize some of the things that happened, some of the conversations that we have, some of the teachable moments as they come up, how I respond to things. And I also really love the moments that show maybe what a student was saying or doing 2 weeks ago versus now, especially the kids who've been coming most or all of the days along the way. So we'll start with Monday. Every Monday, we have at least a few new students. Every week, there are students who weren't registered prior, and this is their first day. So that happens every Monday. Families make their own schedule for summer camp. So some students come on certain days of the week, every week. Some students come just certain weeks at a time. And I have some students that are there every day that we have camp. So it's really every day is a little bit different, and every week is even more different because each week there are some kids who aren't there. Maybe they're on a trip or at another camp. And then there's kids who are there for the first time, or kids who are coming back after being on vacation or at another camp. So Mondays are always kind of like fruit basket turnover. Let's see who's here today. So we had a few new students on Monday of week 3. One of the things that happened on this particular Monday is almost everybody was complaining about something. Some of the kids were complaining about how hot it was. Some of the kids were complaining about the walk to the playground. Some of the kids were complaining about other kids. So we have about 10 kids every day, and at least 7 of them were complaining about something. I have a really high patience level, especially with my students. There's not a lot that really gets to me, but on this day, the complaining was really burrowing into my brain. At the playground, I think, some of the kids were kind of feeding off of each other. And so the energy just was negative and heavy. And so when we were leaving the playground, so we're about 45 minutes into camp at this point, I stopped everybody and I pointed out the 3 students who hadn't complained about anything. And I pointed out how it made me really want to be around them because they weren't complaining so much. And it made me more comfortable to be around people who weren't complaining. Once I talked about that, several of the kids stopped complaining. So we walked back to Starfish. Several of the kids had stopped. When we got into Starfish, we had a group discussion about this. Complaining is something that I talk about in our year-round program because complaining is really common for not just kids, but people who are neurodivergent. And it is because part of especially autism, also ADHD, is a reduced ability to understand other people's thoughts and feelings. And so people who have neurotypical brains tend to understand much more efficiently that complaining makes other people not want to be around them. But people who don't always see that connection between their choices and other people's thoughts and feelings really miss that point. And so they're more prone to complain about things because they miss that connection. And also, people who are neurodivergent are much more likely to not have as much of a social filter, which we usually associate as being a negative aspect. We usually think about somebody not having a filter as meaning they say things that hurt people's feelings, they say things that other people couldn't imagine saying, but it also just means they say things without understanding how it affects other people. It doesn't always necessarily mean it's something negative. So complaining is all of these things together. It's really just somebody talking about what they think and how they feel. But the majority of people in the world will hold that in. They will choose not to say those things out loud. And a lot of neurodivergent people just don't really have the social understanding to know why we wouldn't just say what we think and how we feel. Being honest, being transparent, being upfront is usually a really big factor in a neurodivergent brain. So we all sat down to talk about complaining, and I have a couple really important points that I make about complaining. One of them is just like how I have kind of this mantra that it's always okay to feel the way you feel. Along with that, I also tell the kids it's always okay to not want to do something. And I asked them, I said, you guys raise your hand if you were hot today. And I purposefully will be the first person to raise my hand because I'm trying to show them I don't want them to pretend they weren't hot. So I will purposely be the first person to raise my hand because I'm trying to show them that this is okay. So I asked the group, raise your hand if you were hot today. Almost everybody raised their hand. Then I said, raise your hand if you didn't really want to walk to the playground today. And again, I was the first person who put my hand up. Almost everybody raised their hand. And so then I explain it's always okay to not want to do something. It's okay to not want to walk to the playground today. I said, a couple of you guys made comments that you didn't even want to be here today. That's okay. And I tell the kids, there are some days that I don't want to be here. There are some days I would rather be laying on my couch or in a swimming pool somewhere or taking a nap. It's okay. It is always okay to feel the way you feel. It is always okay to not want to do something or to not want to go somewhere. When we validate how other people are thinking and feeling, number one, it makes them much more receptive to whatever we have to say next. And number two, it switches their brain out of emotion and into logic. You cannot be in both areas of your brain at the same time. So when somebody is very emotional about something, they aren't able to be logical and rational. But once we can empathize with them and let them, nobody's in trouble for complaining. This isn't a lecture. This is a conversation that we're all having together. I'm not getting on to anybody. Nobody's in trouble in any way. I'm empathizing with them. I was also hot. I also didn't really want to walk to the playground. So now I've switched. I've also turned off their defensiveness, right? There's nothing to be defensive about. I've validated that it's okay to feel that way. So now we can have a logical conversation about complaining. My stance with complaining, what I teach my students is that first I'll ask them, does complaining make the problem better or worse? It doesn't always make it worse, but it definitely doesn't make it better. And that's what I want them to recognize, that complaining does not make it better. The only time you might be able to say that is if you annoy somebody so much that they take you out of the situation, right? So if the kids were complaining so much that I was just like, fine, we're just going to go back. That's the only time that you could say that complaining made something better, which also means those of us responding to complaining need to be careful not to allow that, that we don't get out of things by complaining about them. Because if we allow that, we are reinforcing the act of complaining. We have shown this person that complaining actually does make things better. Definitely not something we want to reinforce. The other thing I do when we talk about complaining is kids don't always even recognize when their voice goes into whiny mode. So here's what I do so that they can recognize this. I make a fun game out of it. And what I teach is that when our voice sounds like a song, and I go like this, I don't want to go to the playground. It's so hot. So when our voice sounds like a song, when it's going up and down, that's usually a sign that we're complaining. And then I have everybody practice. It takes something that's real and makes it fun and funny, because now they can all recognize that they do that. I also can point it out later when it's happening in actual situations. Oh, your voice sounds like a song right now. So we all get to practice our whiny, complainy voice. And then I point out that usually the only thing that happens when people complain is that it makes other people not want to be around them. And if we're complaining often, other people will feel that way about us often. And I always give an example from my real life of a situation many years ago when my life was a bit different. And I was at an event with a middle school age person. And they were complaining about being tired. It was very early in the morning. They were complaining about being hungry. We were supposed to be fed at this event. They were complaining about being cold because we had not yet made it in the door. We were outside. And I pointed out how probably everybody that was there was all of those things. Even if they weren't some of them, they were probably at least one of them: tired, hungry, cold. Everybody who was there, because we were all standing outside. It was very early in the morning. It was chilly, and we knew we were going to be fed. So most likely people had not eaten. So I pointed out how everybody there probably felt most of those same feelings. But can you imagine if everybody there started complaining, and how awkward and uncomfortable that would be? And the kids really understand that. And so we talked about how the person I was with, them complaining didn't fix anything. It definitely did not make people want to let us in sooner. And it just made everybody around us feel awkward and uncomfortable. Another thing that I talk about sometimes in one of our lessons where we talk about being part of a group, we talk about how many people in a group, and I give the example of the group that we're in while we're having this lesson. So usually it's minimum of 5 of us, maximum of 12, just depending on the group. So I'll use the group as an example. I'll say, look around this group right now. How many people in our group right now would need to be in a crummy mood for it to make everybody feel a little bit uncomfortable? And most of the time, the numbers are pretty, some people say like half the people in the group. Some people will say like 3 people. And we get to the point where we all can recognize that it would really only take 1. And sometimes I'll even give examples. Remember a couple weeks ago when this happened and all of us felt a little bit awkward, a little bit uncomfortable. So we recognize that it only takes 1 person being crabby or uncomfortable or complaining to make everybody feel uncomfortable. And the kids don't have a concept of that before we have these conversations. That's why these conversations are so important. After we had the discussion about complaining, the rest of the day was very different. Now, granted, we weren't outside anymore, but the rest of the day just had a different energy to it. We went from like 7 kids complaining to, we just had a couple other challenges, but not related to complaining. It really changed the dynamic of the day, which I was really glad for because it got really just kind of negative. I mean, the energy was just really negative with that many kids complaining about things. Another thing that happened on Monday at Starfish Social Club, I tend to get siblings pretty regularly. Autism, ADHD, social challenges. It's not that uncommon that more than one kiddo in a family will experience these, especially autism. It's shown to have a high rate of, running in families. So over the years, I've had lots of siblings come through Starfish Social Club. My ideal situation is that they're not in the same group. Number one, because they already have their own built-in challenges with each other that they're bringing already. But number two, I want every kid to be their own kid. I want them to meet their own friends, have their own interests, play their own games that they like, have their own experience. And that is difficult with siblings because they tend to either gravitate toward each other or have a lot of what's a good word, strife with each other. Kind of goes, or both, right? Some kids definitely have both, but logistically it's not always an option. Especially at summer camp, we're all together, so the only way for siblings to not be together would be for them to come on different days. So logistically, it's not always an option for siblings to not be in the same group. When that happens, I try to create ways where we separate during the day. For example, a lot of the days that I have siblings are the days where the game time challenge is to play with someone that you don't know, right? That's a really easy way that I can break up some of those sibling groups. I also sometimes during the activities, I'll be mindful about who's sitting where and what activities I'm giving to different kids, just so I can try to break some of that up. On this particular Monday, we had 2 brothers who this was their first day, and they started off within less than 5 minutes arguing with each other. And it got really awkward for everybody else that was in the room because they were raising their voices, they were yelling at each other, they were picking at each other. My perception is that one of the kiddos knew what to say to bother the other one, and then the other one would have a big reaction to it. And so I just very firmly let them know that we weren't going to do that at summer camp, that none of the other kids were arguing with each other. That wasn't really a thing that we did. And I pointed out how it made it really awkward for everyone else when they were just arguing with each other. And I said that we needed to have a deal where they weren't going to argue with each other anymore for the rest of the day at camp. And again, I think pointing that out to them, they had no consideration for how them arguing impacted everybody else in the group. There was no awareness of that. And so I think just pointing that out just built that awareness that did not exist before. Another thing that we worked on Monday was there were several times on Monday where kids would come to me and tell me that somebody else was bothering them. He's copying me. She took my block, whatever the case may be. I think we do kids a disservice by teaching them to tell an adult when something happens that they don't like. I think we really do them a disservice. What I teach kids is to tell that person, because I am not the one who was doing whatever it is that was done. That wasn't me. So what I always do is I will, if somebody comes to me, like was happening on Monday, I will say, did you tell him? Did you give him feedback? Did you tell her what you think about that? And they always say no. This is, again, campus mostly new students this year. Students who've been in Starfish know this already, that I don't, and unless there's a safety situation where somebody's being hurt, then absolutely I will intervene. But otherwise, I want my students to learn how to give people feedback. Teaching our kids to tell an adult, number one, makes them a target. It makes them a tattletale. Number two, it shows that they're not capable of handling things on their own. And number three, there is not always going to be an adult to tell. Especially as our kids get older, there is not always going to be a parent or a teacher around for them to tell when something's happening that's bothering them. So I think it happened 3 times on Monday that different kids came up to me to kind of tell on somebody doing something. And every time I would say, did you give that person feedback? Did you talk to them about it? And then I will go with them to give this other person feedback, because I want to make sure that the feedback is received. Okay, so it's kind of a two-way thing. We have 2 weeks in our year-round program. It's actually in the first module that starts in August. 2 weeks that we spend on giving people feedback and on receiving feedback, which is harder than giving feedback. So we worked through that a few times. And then it came up later in the afternoon. One of the kids was bothering the other kids. He was upset, which we'll talk about, and he was intentionally kind of sabotaging some of the other kids' games because he wasn't playing. And so it's another great opportunity to talk about giving somebody feedback. And when they were giving him feedback, he was not taking it. He just kept doing what he was doing. So then we have a whole group conversation, which we've had before. We also had it during week 2. Some of the kids are different. So again, we'll have the conversation about how do we give somebody feedback if they're doing something that's bothering us. And if you are getting feedback asking you to stop, what do you think you should do next? And everybody will say, stop. All right. So it goes both ways. Number one is the ability to give another person feedback. Our kids also tend to over-assume that the things that other people do are intentional and personal. Classic example, let's say that your kiddo is in middle school and they're walking down the hallway and somebody bumps into them. Our kids, more than neurotypical kids, will assume that that was personal, it was about them, and that it was intentional, when usually it was not either one. Even, little things that might happen at Starfish, maybe the kids are sitting really close to each other. And so somebody moves and it knocks down a tower that another kiddo was building. It's not intentional or personal at all. It's because they were sitting really close to each other. But that's where you get the, hey, right? The big reactions is because our kids are more likely than the general population to interpret things as negative and personal. And it all goes back to the struggle with understanding other people's perspectives, the struggle with understanding that could have been an accident. For a lot of our kids, that's just not even in their awareness that it could have been an accident. So giving people feedback, one of the things that we have to think about is we have to assume that this person did not do that thing on purpose. We're going to go into this assuming that they don't even know that this thing just happened, or that they don't even know that this thing is bothering us. And so that's why we need to let them know in a calm, assertive way. Okay, so that's giving and receiving feedback. And I have one more thing to add to that before we get to the end of the day on Monday. One of the kids who's been coming to camp every day had a really rough day on this Monday. And what's interesting is that when I was talking to his parents about it at the end of the day, one of them asked if I thought it had to do with there being new kids there. And my response was no, because there's new kids all the time. There's at least a couple new kids every other day. And every Monday we have new kids. So, and he's really adaptable to new people. So I didn't feel like it was about new kids. But I think I mentioned the level of complaining that was happening at the beginning of the day. And one of his parents felt like that was it, that is what had really gotten to him. He had such a rough day. I mean, there were some, he was at game time going around and intentionally sabotaging other people's games. He walked across a game board that kids were actively playing on because most of them sit on the floor. He walked across it. He went in another group and took a piece from one game and started throwing it at the pieces of another game. I mean, he was going out of his way to kind of, sabotage these other kids playing their games. And so it was really interesting talking to his parents about it later and the possible connection that had to the energy of the group in the first 45 minutes. And like I said, it was even really getting to me, which it takes a lot for things to get to me. But it was just such a negative energy. And I will also say that for several years, I haven't registered new kids in summer camp. It's only been kids who are in the year-round program. And this is one of the reasons why I made that decision, because this many new kids at one time, these are the things I expect to happen. These are kind of the typical cycles. And so it's a lot to support this many new kids at one time. And I think that's what happened on Monday is even though we all moved past it and the energy really shifted, I think he was holding on to that energy. It was really negative. So he had a really rough day. But as I talked about in week 2, my priority is making sure that kids know we can always try again and we can always make things better. So he had missed out on game time, and it got to the last 30 minutes of the day, which is marbles and tiles time, which is magic time. I actually had to secretly move all the other kids into a different room. We have multiple kind of rooms in our suite. So I had to kind of secretly move the kids to another room, and I let them start marbles and tiles early because I was focused on supporting him. And so once he realized that they were all playing marbles and tiles, we kind of, everything came to a head. There's a big kind of explosion at that point once he realized what was happening. From that point to his recovery point was actually pretty short. So we had a really long period of just kind of general defiance and interfering with other kids and that kind of thing. But then when the big moment came, from then to recovery was actually really short, much shorter than I was expecting. So once he was able to regroup, he said, he wanted to go do marbles and tiles. I want him to be able to do marbles and tiles because I want him to end on a positive note. I want him to know that that's possible. But I also don't just open the door and say, yep, go ahead, go do it. So I asked him, I really love to ask the kids for their thoughts because it also takes out so much of the conflict when I can ask them for a suggestion, because then it's not coming from me. So I asked him, I said, what do you think that you could do to be able to go play with marbles and tiles? because the kids that are playing, you've been pretty rude to them this afternoon. You've destroyed some of their games. Like several of them gave you feedback that you weren't listening to. So I said, what do you think you could do in order to go do marbles and tiles with them? And he very quickly said, I could play a game with someone and then I can do marbles and tiles. I was really open to that. It also showed me that he had figured that out from the first couple weeks. And so I did say to him, I said, I'm going to ask the group if anybody wants to play with you, what game do you want to play? And he said chess. So I said, okay, I'm going to ask the group if anybody wants to play chess with you. And I said, I think it's really important that we help establish expectations with things like this. I said, I don't know that anybody's going to say yes, because that would mean that they would leave marbles and tiles. So I'm going to ask them, but just know that I don't know if anybody's going to say yes. So I went out and I asked the kids, I said, hey, so-and-so would like to know if anybody would like to play chess with him. And immediately 2 kids said yes, which surprised me, not because of the situation, but because it meant leaving marbles and tiles. And so I went with the kiddo who said yes first, and he went in the other room, and they ended up doing I have a board that's chess, checkers, and tic-tac-toe. They ended up doing tic-tac-toe, which is much shorter than a game of chess. And they did 2 rounds of that and then decided that was good and went to do marbles and tiles. And we ended the day with everybody in the group doing marbles and tiles, which is always my goal. No matter what else has happened in the preceding 3 hours, my goal is always for us to end the day with everybody in the group doing this thing that's so motivational to them. So I was really glad that we got there, because this kiddo really had a hard time. And, I don't have a magic 8 ball. I don't ever know how things are going to turn out. I don't know, but I've been doing this for so long that I know things I can say and do that make it more likely, while also teaching my students how to take responsibility for their choices. So I was really glad at how that worked out. One of the things that was happening during game time is, because it was a Monday, the game time challenge was play with somebody that you haven't played with before. And again, I had 2 brothers. I was trying to kind of separate them. Actually had 2 sibling groups on this particular day, 2 groups of 2. So just kind of trying to separate the people that they kind of always gravitate toward each other. One of the new kiddos ended up playing a game. Oh, also on this day, if you went through the episode for week 2, you remember the kiddo who tore his paper and how that situation ended up just kind of getting bigger and bigger. And when he left at the end of the day, he did not leave with marbles and tiles. That situation just got bigger and bigger and didn't ever get resolved. That kiddo was back on this Monday of week 3 for his 2nd day of camp. Significantly better. Oh my gosh, so much better. An interesting thing is, when he walked in the door, I said, hey, I'm so glad to see you again. And he said, I'm sorry. It's the first thing he said to me. And I said, what are you sorry for? And I don't remember exactly what he said, but, basically for, the choices that he made and that kind of thing. When we got to, he was one of the kids that was complaining earlier in the day, just like most of the rest of them were. When we got to he did really well during the activity. So if you remember from his day 1, the activity is when things kind of started going downhill. He did really well during the activity, got to game time. He picked a partner. Day 1, he missed all of game time. So on this day, he picked a partner. He and his partner really struggled together. One of the things that I have learned is that the kids who struggle the most with another kid, so conflicts between kids, most often is two kids who are very similar. And they are so similar that they have conflict with each other. This also applies to homes. You may have two people in a home that have conflict because they're very similar. It is actually easier for us to understand someone who thinks differently than for us to understand someone who thinks like we do. So these two kids really were having a hard time playing a game together. They were accusing each other of cheating. There was just a lot of raised voices and frustration. When I paid attention to the game they were playing, I could see that a lot of the stress was due to the game itself. They had chosen a game called Spot It, which is a really fun game. There's multiple versions and there's even multiple ways to play the game. But the basis of the game is that it is a stack of cards, and every card has multiple symbols on it. And no matter which two cards you're looking at, they all have one symbol in common. And so it's a race to see who can find the most common symbols. So for example, the first pair of cards, the common symbol may be a question mark. Then you turn over two more cards and the common symbol may be an ice cube. So it's different every time, but every two cards has one symbol in common. That's what these kids were playing. And what I realized is that every time they turned new cards over, so every turn was a chance to argue. Whereas in most other games, that's not the case. In most other games, you take your turn, the other person takes their turn, take your turn, the other person takes their turn. The only conflict really is if it's a game where somebody's getting knocked out, for example. But in this game, every turn was an opportunity for conflict. They were arguing over who said it first. One of the kids was, if the other kid got it first, he would try to act like he got it first. It's just every turn was conflict. And so I suggested to them that they choose a different game. And they did. I don't remember what game they ended up with, but after they chose a different game, that was the end of the conflict. I mean, it went from being like really loud and stressful to them playing a game together just because I asked them to choose a different game. So that was one of the kids in that situation was the kiddo who had torn his paper a week prior. He made it all the way through the day, through marbles and tiles. He had a really great day. So like I said, he was one of the kids who was complaining, but most of them were. One of the things that happened, I don't remember the exact scenario, but there was something during game time that he apologized for, but he kept doing it. I can't remember what I can see his face. I can see us talking to each other, but I can't remember the situation. And so one of the things I said to him, which I actually have a whole lesson on this as well, I have a whole lesson on apologizing, is apologizing isn't helpful if you don't change your choices. So my take on apologizing, I don't ever expect or require anybody to apologize for anything. Because I think when we do that, we get artificial apologies. We also can reinforce the habit of apologizing by default, which is when you get kids who over apologize. And to me, over apologizing is more of a concern than not apologizing. I actually wouldn't care at all if nobody in the world ever apologized to me ever again. I really wouldn't care, because what I would be looking for is, are they changing their behavior? And so that's the conversation I had with this kiddo. Is I said, I noticed that you've apologized a couple times today, but you're still doing the same thing. You haven't changed your choices. And so I said, when people do that, it makes it seem like their apology isn't real. And it makes people not really believe it when they apologize. So I said, let's just work on changing the choices that you're making. And that way, you won't even feel like you have to apologize. Let me see. Okay, one more thing that I have on the list for Monday. I have a kiddo. This was his first week this summer, but I worked with him a lot last summer and prior to that. It's not uncommon for kids to leave and come back to Starfish. Um, so I had worked with him in the past, and then he was at camp last summer, and then this was his first week this summer. I don't remember seeing this in him before, but I had a previous student where this was a big issue with. So it's not very common at all. But when I do see it, it almost always looks the same. I think it's interesting how every child shows up differently socially, right? Every child has some different things going on, but I don't know that I ever see new stuff anymore. It's, every kiddo reminds me of another kiddo. Oh, I remember when so-and-so used to struggle with that. Oh, I remember, how I helped this kid with that. It's like, I don't really see things that are new anymore. Sometimes they're just in different combinations. And so the cool thing about that is as soon as I recognized it, I knew how I could support it because I've done it before. So this kiddo, I already know, is very socially anxious. And one of the big things is I talked a few weeks ago about social anxiety and how I think we all have some form of social anxiety. And for some people, it makes us withdraw from social. For some people, it makes us go all in. He really enjoys being around other people his age. He just feels anxious. But because he enjoys it, he over engages. He will go in and start asking people a bunch of questions, and kind of like interview mode, just asking a bunch of questions, even if they're not really reciprocating, even if they don't really seem interested. And what I noticed him doing on Monday that I hadn't noticed in previous years was this thing that's all nervous energy, and it causes people to have what would be considered inappropriate reactions, usually to situations where somebody's getting hurt, they're getting in trouble, they're upset. So this kiddo and another student that I've had in the past, the struggle is that when things happen and they don't really know how to respond, they get nervous and they start laughing. I remember with the other kiddo, back when my dog was with us, she was very old, and she would come to Starfish every day, and sometimes she would fall because she was very old. Sometimes she would start coughing. And this other kiddo that was struggling with this would start laughing every time she did that. He loved her very much, really loved her, but he would start laughing when she would fall or when she would start coughing. And of course, all the other kids would get really angry, right? Like, how can you laugh at her? Like, she's old and she's falling or she's coughing. But I knew he's not laughing because he thinks it's funny. He's laughing because he doesn't know how else to respond when something awkward happens. So that's what I saw in this kiddo on Monday as well. One of the kids fell and was upset, and this kiddo was laughing. There was a couple other things. I think when the one kiddo was having a really hard time, he was laughing. But I know that he's anxious. And when I talked to him about it, what was interesting is he wasn't even really aware that he was laughing. The other kiddo I worked with knew that he was. He just couldn't help it. This kiddo wasn't even really aware that he was responding that way. So first thing, usually it takes a while for kids to be able to develop some strategies to stop doing this. But as you can imagine, this is really triggering for people when you think, especially kids, when you think that someone's laughing at you when you're upset or hurt. It's very triggering for other people. So it's important to me that we implement some strategies immediately, because this is going to cause this kiddo to have other kids not like him. And that's definitely not what I want. So the first things I teach are walk away, or if you can't walk away, if it's not a situation that's walk awayable, cover your mouth with your hands or turn your head away. Because what we don't want is for people to see that you're laughing. So if you can't help it, which usually at first they can't, walk away or cover your mouth so that at least other people aren't seeing it. Okay. And then while we're doing this, I want you to pay attention to how everybody else is responding. Some people might be responding empathetically, right? Like trying to be supportive, trying to be kind. Some people might just be observing. They might not be doing anything, but they're not laughing, right? They're just observing the situation. So just paying attention to how other people are responding. You don't have to say or do anything. If somebody else falls, you don't have to go up and ask them if they're okay. But standing back and watching what everybody else is doing is a much more socially appropriate response than laughing. So we're just replacing, right? We're replacing laughing with neutrality or with observing. And with the other kiddo that I worked with on this, we got to where it was no longer a thing. Him laughing at socially inappropriate times was no longer a thing. Okay, so that was Monday. That's a lot about Monday. So I never know how long my episodes are going to be. I just hit the record button and I talk until I run out of things to say. And it's not until after I stop the recording that I can see how long it was. And I realized that the amount of time I talked about week 3 was over an hour and 20 minutes. And so I decided to break week 3 into 2 episodes. I talked about Monday for more than 45 minutes. So this will be the end of this episode where I'm just talking about things that happened on Monday. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of week 3 will be next week's episode. So I hope you enjoyed this episode all about one day at summer camp. And next week, you'll get to hear what happened the rest of the week. I'm glad that you're here, and I'll see you next week.